The American's Tale by Arthur Conan Doyle. "It air strange, it air," he was saying as I opened the door of the room to where our social little semi-literary society met. "But I could tell you queerer things than that 'ere. Almighty queer things. You can't learn everything out of books, sirs, nohow. You see, it ain't the men as can string English together and has had good education as find themselves in the queer places I've been in. They're mostly rough men, sirs, as can scarce speak aright, far less tell with pen and ink than the things they've seen. But if they could, they'd make some of you Europeans' hair riz with astonishment. They would, sirs, you bet." His name was Jefferson Adams, I believe. I know his initials were J.A., for you may see them yet deeply whittled on the right-hand upper panel of our smoking-room door. He left us this legacy, and also some artistic patterns done in tobacco juice upon our Turkey carpet. But beyond these reminiscences, our American storyteller has vanished from our ken. He gleamed across our ordinary, quiet conviviality, like some brilliant meteor, and then was lost in the outer darkness. That night, however, our Nevada friend was in full swing, and I quietly lit my pipe and dropped into the nearest chair, anxious not to interrupt his story. "Mind you," he continued, "I hain't got no grudge against your men of science. I likes and respect a chap as can match every beast and plant from a huckleberry to a grizzly with a jaw-breaking name. But if you wants real interesting facts, something a bit juicy, you go to your whalers, your frontiersmen, your scouts, and Hudson Bay men, chaps who mostly can scarce sign their names." There was a pause here as Mr. Jefferson Adams produced a long cheroot and lit it. We preserved a strict silence in the room, for we had already learned that on the slightest interruption our Yankee drew himself into his shell again. He glanced around with a self-satisfied smile as he remarked our expectant looks, and continued through a halo of smoke. "Now, which of you gentlemen has ever been in Arizona? None, I'll warrant. And of all English or Americans as can put pen to paper, how many has been in Arizona? Precious few, I calculate. I've been there, sirs, lived there for years, and when I think of what I've seen there, why, I can scarce get myself to believe it now. Ah, there's a country. I was one of Walker's filibusters, as they chose to call us, and after we'd busted up and the chief was shot, some of us made tracks and located down there. A regular English and American colony we was, with our wives and children, and all complete. I reckon there's some of the old folk there yet, and that they ain't forgotten what I'm going to tell you. No, I warrant they ain't. Never on this side of the grave, sirs. I was talking about the country, though, and I guess I could astonish you considerable if I spoke of nothing else. To think of such a land being built for a few greasers and half-breeds. It's a misusing of the gift of Providence, that's what I calls it. Grass has hung over a chap's head as he rode through it, and trees so thick that you couldn't catch a glimpse of blue sky for leagues and leagues, and orchids like umbrellas. Maybe some on you has seen a plant that they calls the flycatcher in some parts of the States? Diona muscipula, murmured Dawson, our scientific man par excellence. Ah, Diana municipal, that's him. You'll see a fly stand on that air plant, and then you'll see the two sides of a leaf snap up together and catch it between them, and grind it up and mash it to bits, for all the world like some great sea squid with its beak, and hours after, if you open the leaf, you'll see the body lying half digested and in bits. Well, I've seen those fly traps in Arizona with leaves 8 and 10 feet long, and thorns or teeth a foot or more. Why, they could, but darn it, I'm going too fast. It's about the death of Joe Hawkins I was going to tell you. About as queer a thing, I reckon, as ever you heard tell on. There wasn't nobody in Montana as didn't know of Joe Hawkins. Alabama Joe, as he was called there. A regular out-and-outer he was, by the darndest skunk as ever a man clapped eyes on. He was a good chap enough, mind ye, as long as you stroked him in the right way. but rile him anyhow, and he were worse nor a wildcat. I've seen him empty his six-shooter into a crowd as chanced to jostle him a-going into Simpson's bar when there was a dance on, and he bowied Tom Hooper 'cause he split his liquor over his whiskey by mistake. No, he didn't stick at murder, Joe didn't, and he weren't a man to be trusted further nor you could see him. Now at that time I tell on when Joe Hawkins was swaggering about the town and laying down the law with his shooting irons, there was an Englishman there the name of Scott, Tom Scott, if I reflects all right. This chap Scott was a thorough Britisher, begging the present company's pardon, and yet he didn't freeze much to the British set there, and they didn't freeze much to him. He was a quiet, simple man, Scott was, rather too quiet for a rough set like that. Sneaking they called him, but he weren't that. He kept himself mostly apart and didn't interfere with nobody as long as he was left alone. Some said as how he'd been kinder ill-treated at home, been a chartist or something of that sort, and had to up stick and run, but he never spoke of it hisself and never complained. Bad luck or good, the chap kept a stiff lip on him. This chap Scott was a sort of bud among the men about Montana, for he was so quiet and simple like. There was no part of either to take up his grievances, for as I've been saying, the Britishers hardly counted him one of them, and many a rough joke they played on him. He never cut up rough, but was polite to all hisself. I think the boys got to think he hadn't much grit in him until he showed 'em their mistake. It was in Simpson's bar as the row got up, and that led to the queer thing I was going to tell you of. Alabama Joe and one or two other rowdies were dead on the Britishers in those days, and they spoke their opinions pretty free, though I warned them as there'd be an almighty muss. That particular night Joe was nigh half drunk, and he swaggered about the town with his six-shooter, looking out for a quarrel. Then he turned into the bar where he knowed he'd find some of the English as ready for one as he was hisself. Sure enough, there was half a dozen lounging out, and Tom Scott standing alone before the stove. Joe sat down by the table and put his revolver and bowie down in front of him. "Them's my arguments, Jeff," he says to me. "If any white-livered Britisher dares give me the lie." I tried to stop him, sirs, but he weren't a man as you could easily turn, and he began to speak in a way as no chap could stand. Why, even a greaser would flare up if you said as much of greaser land. There was a commotion at the bar, and every man laid his hands on his weapons, but before they could draw we heard a quiet voice from the stove. "Say your prayers, Joe Hawkins, for by heaven you're a dead man." Joe turned around and looked like grabbing at his irons, but it weren't no matter of use. Tom Scott was standing up, covering him with his derringer, a smile on his white face, but the very devil shining in his eye. "It ain't that the old country has used me over well," he says, "but no man shall speak again it afore me and live." For a second or two I could see his fingers tighten around the trigger, and then he gave a laugh and threw the pistol on the floor. "No," he says, "I can't shoot a half-drunk man. Take your dirty life, Joe, and use it better nor you have done. You've been nearer to the grave this night than you will again until your time comes. You best make tracks now, I guess. Nay, never look black at me, man. I'm not afeard at your shooting iron. A bully's nigh always a coward." As he swung contemptuously around and relit his half-smoked pipe from the stove, while Alabama slunk out of the bar with the laughs of the Britishers ringing in his ears, I saw his face as he passed me, and on it I saw murder, sirs, murder, as plain as I'd ever seed anything in my life. I stayed in the bar after the row and watched Tom Scott as he shook hands with the men about. It seemed kind of queer to me to see him smiling and cheerful like, for I knew Joe was bloodthirsty mind, and that Englishman had small chance of ever seeing the morning. He lived in an out-of-the-way sort of place, you see, clean off the trail, and had to pass through the Flytrap Gulch to get it. This here gulch was a marshy, gloomy place, lonely enough during the day even, for it were always a creep sort of thing to see the Great Eight, and 10-foot leaves snapping up if I'd touch 'em. But at night there were never a soul near. Some parts of the marsh, too, were soft and deep, and a body thrown in would be gone by the morning. I could see Alabama Joe crouching under the leaves of the great fly trap in the darkest part of the gulch, with a scowl on his face and a revolver in his hands. I could see it, sir, as plain as day with my 2 eyes. About midnight, Simpson shuts up his bar, so out we had to go. Tom Scott started off for his 3-mile walk at a slashing pace. I just dropped him a hint as he passed me, for I kind of like the chap. "Keep your derringer loose in your belt, sir," I says, "for you might chance to need it." He looked around at me with his quiet smile, and then I lost sight of him in the gloom. I never thought to see him again. He'd hardly gone afore Simpson comes up to me and says, "There'll be a nice job at the Flytrap Gulch tonight, Jeff. The boy says Hawkins started half an hour ago to wait for Scott and shoot him on sight. I calculate the coroner'll be wanted tomorrow." What passed in the gulch that night, it were a question as were asked pretty free next morning. A half-breed was in Ferguson's store after daybreak, and he said as he chanced to be near the gulch about 1 in the morning. It weren't easy to get at his story. He seemed so uncommon scared. But he told us at last, as he'd heard the fearfulest screams in the stillness of the night. They weren't no shots, he said, but screams after scream, kinder muffled, like a man with a serape over his head and in mortal pain. Abner, Brandon, and me and a few more was in the store at the time, so we mounted and rode out to Scott's house, passing through the gulch on the way. There weren't nothing particular to be seen there, no blood nor marks of a fight, nor nothing. And when we gets up to Scott's house, he comes out to meet us as fresh as a lark. "Hello, Jeff," says he. "No need for the pistol after all. Come in, have a cocktail, boys." "Did you see or hear nothing as you came home last night?" says I. "No," says he. "All was quiet enough. An owl kind of moaning in the Flytrap Gulch, that was all. Come, jump off and have a glass." "Thank ye," said Abner. So off we gets, and Tom Scott rode into the settlement with us when we went back. An all-fired commotion was on in Main Street as we rode into it. The American party seemed to have gone clean crazed. Alabama Joe was gone, not a darn particle of him left. Since he went out in the gulch, Nary and I had seen him. As we got off our horses, there was a considerable crowd in front of Simpson's bar, and some ugly looks at Tom Scott, I can tell you. There was a clicking of pistols, and I saw as Scott had his hand in his bosom, too. There weren't a single English face about. "Stand aside, Jeff Adams," said Zeb Humphrey, as great a scoundrel as ever lived. "You hain't got no hand in this game. Say, boys, are we free Americans to be murdered by any darn Britisher?" It was the quickest thing I'd ever seed. There was a rush and a crack. Zeb was down, with Scott's ball in his thigh. Scott himself was on the ground with a dozen men holding him. There weren't no use struggling, so he lay quiet. They seemed a bit uncertain what to do with him, but then one of Alabama's special chums put them up to it. "Joe's gone," he said. "Nothing ain't sure nor that, and there lies the man as killed him. Some on you knows as Joe went on business to the gulch that night. He never came back. That 'ere Britisher passed through after he'd gone. They had a row. Scream is heard among the great fly traps. I say again, he played poor Joe some of his sneaking tricks and throw him into the swamp. Ain't no wonder as the body is gone. But are we to stand by and see English murdering our own chums? I guess not. Let Judge Lynch try him, that's what I say." "Lynch him!" shouted 100 angry voices, for all the rag, tag, and bobtail of the settlement was round us by this time. "Here, boys, fetch a rope and swing 'em up. Up with him over Simpson's door. See here, though," says another, coming forward. "Let's hang him by the great fly trap in the gulch. Let Joe see as he's revenge, if so be as he's buried by there." There was a shout for this, and away they went, with Scott tied on his mustang in the middle, and a mounted guard with cocked revolvers round him. For we knew as there was a score or so Britishers about as didn't seem to recognize Judge Lynch and was dead on a free fight. I went out with him, my heart bleeding for Scott, though he didn't seem a cent put out, he didn't. He were game to the backbone, seemed kind of queer, sirs, hanging a man to a fly trap. But ours were a regular tree, and the leaves like a brace of boats with a hinge between 'em and thorns at the bottom. We passed down the gulch to the place where the great one grows, and there we seated with leaves, some open, some shut. But we seed something worse than that. Standing round the tree was some 30 men, Britishers all, and armed to the teeth. They was waiting for us evidently, and had a business-like look about 'em, as if they'd come for something and meant to have it. There was raw material there for about as warm a scrimmage as I'd ever seed. As we rode up, a great red-bearded Scotchman, Cameron was his name, stood out afore the rest, his revolver cocked in his hand. "See here, boys," he says, "you've got no call to hurt a hair off that man's head. You hain't proved as Joe is dead yet, and if you had, you hain't proved as Scott killed him. Anyhow, if it were in self-defense, for all you know, as he was lying in wait for Scott, to shoot him on sight. So I say again, you hain't got no call to hurt that man. And what's more, I've got 36 bailed arguments against how you're doing it." "It's an interesting point, worth arguing out," said the man, as was Alabama's Joe's special chum. There was a clicking of pistols and a loosening of knives, and the two parties began to draw up on another, and it looked like a rise in the mortality of Montana. Scott was standing behind with the pistol at his ear if he stirred, looking quiet and composed as having no money on the table, when suddenly he gives a start and a shout as rang in our ears like a trumpet. "Joe!" he cried. "Joe, look at him in the fly trap!" We all turned and looked where he was pointing. Jerusalem! I think we won't get that picture out of our minds again. One of the great leaves of the fly trap that had been shut and touching the ground as it lay was slowly rolling back upon its hinges. There, lying like a child in its cradle, was Alabama Joe in the hollow of the leaf. The great thorn had been slowly driven through his heart as it shut upon him. We could see, as he tried to cut his way out, for there was a slit in the thick, fleshy leaf, and his bowie was in his hand, but it had smothered him first. He lay down on it, likely to keep the damp off while he were waiting for Scott, and it had closed on him as you've seen your little hothouse ones do on a fly, and there he were as we found him, torn and crushed into a pulp by the great jagged teeth of a man-eating plant. There, sirs, I think you'll own as that's a curious story. "And what became of Scott?" asked Jack Sinclair. "Well, we carried him back on our shoulders, we did, to Simpson's bar, and he stood liquors around us. Made a speech, too, a darn fine speech, from the counter. Something about the British Lion and the American Eagle walking arm in arm forever and a day. And now, sirs, that yarn was long, and my chair-root's out, so I reckon I'll make tracks afore it's later." And with a "good night," he left the room. "A most extraordinary narrative," said Dawson. "Who would have thought a Dianoa had such power?" "Deuced rum yarn," said young Sinclair. "Evidently a matter-of-fact, truthful man," said the doctor. "Or the most original liar that ever lived," said I. "I wonder which he was."
The Beast in the Cave by H.P. Lovecraft. April 21, 1905. The horrible conclusion which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthine recess of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path. That nevermore should I behold the blessed light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside, my reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed. Yet, indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor. For although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of an ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulchre as that which any churchyard might afford, a conception which carried with it more of tranquillity than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some, I knew, had gone mad under circumstances such as these, but I felt that this end would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unknown to the guide I had separated myself from a regular party of sightseers, and wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which I had pursued since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire. Soon I would be enveloped by the total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning and unsteady light, I idly wondered over the exact circumstances of my coming end. I remembered the accounts which I had heard of the colony of consumptives who, taking their residence in the gigantic grotto to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world, with its steady uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of the ill-made cottages as I passed them by with the party, and had wondered what unnatural influence a long sojourn in this immense and silent cave would exert upon one as healthy and vigorous as I. Now, I grimly told myself, my opportunity for settling this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me too speedy a departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected. So, summoning all the powers possessed by my lungs, I set up a series of loud shoutings in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamor. Yet as I called, I believed in my heart that my cries were to no purpose, and that my voice, magnified and reflected by the numberless ramparts of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, my attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky floor of the cavern. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? Had then all my horrible apprehensions been for naught, and was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? Whilst these joyful queries arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries, in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when in an instant my delight was turned to horror as I listened. For my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbed understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of this subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the paws of some feline. Besides, when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had by my own cries aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion which had accidentally strayed within the cave. Perhaps, I considered, the Almighty had chosen for me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instinct of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my breast, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me for a sterner and more lingering end, I determined nevertheless to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind conceived of no intent on the part of the visitor save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of a guiding sound, lose its direction as had I, and thus pass me by. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfalls steadily advanced. The animal evidently had obtained my scent, which in an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influences as that of the cave could doubtless be followed at great distance. Seeing therefore that I must be armed for defense against an uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I groped about me for the largest of the fragments of rock which were strewn upon all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and grasping one in each hand for immediate use, awaited with resignation the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. Certainly, the conduct of the creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison between hind and fore feet, yet at brief and infrequent intervals. I fancied that 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had paid for its curiosity to investigate one of the entrances of the fearful grotto, with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, bats, and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that are wafted in at every fresh net of the Green River, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what alteration cave life might have wrought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died after a long residence in the cave. Then I remembered with a start, even should I succeed in felling my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long since been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension in my brain now became frightful. My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer, nearer the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream. Yet had I been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing, my voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified, rooted to the spot. I doubted if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. Now the steady pat of the step was close at hand. Now very close. I could hear the labored breathing of the animal, and terror-struck as I was, I realized that it must have come from a considerable distance, and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trustworthy sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone which it contained toward that point in the darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering, and, wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing at a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively, for with a flood of joy I listened that the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued in heavy, gasping inhalations and expirations, whence I realized that I had no more than wounded the creature. And now all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last, something allied to groundless, superstitious fear had entered my brain, and I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as nearly as I could estimate in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly, I heard a sound, or rather a regular succession of sounds. In another instant, they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp, metallic clicks, This time there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted, yelled, screamed, and shrieked with joy as I beheld, in the vaulted arches above, the faint and glimmering effulgence, which I knew to be the reflected light of an approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, was lying upon the ground at the feet of the guide, embracing his boots and gibbering despite my boasted reserve in a most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story and at the same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. At length I awoke to something like normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his own intuitive sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of by-passages just ahead of where he had last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect upon the strange beast which I had wounded but a short distance back in the darkness, and suggested that we ascertain, by the flashlight's aid, what manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time of a courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. Soon we descried a white object upon the floor, an object whiter even than the gleaming limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a simultaneous ejaculation of wonderment, for all the unnatural monsters either of us had in our lifetimes beheld, this was in surpassing degree the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropoid ape of large proportions, escaped, perhaps, from some itinerant menagerie. Its hair was snow white, a thing due to no doubt the bleaching action of a long existence within the inky confines of the cave, but it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The face was turned away from us as the creature lay almost directly upon it. The inclination of the limbs was very singular, explaining, however, the alternation in their use which I had before noted, whereby the beast used sometimes all 4, and on other occasions but 2 for its progress. From the tips of the fingers or toes, long rat-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not prehensile, a fact that I ascribed to that long residence in the cave which, as I before mentioned, seemed evident from the all-pervading and almost unearthly whiteness so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had now grown very feeble, and the guide had drawn his pistol with the evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emitted by the latter caused the weapon to fall unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wonder if this unnatural quality were not the result of a long, continued, and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since its first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once a fleeting spasm of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast. The paws went through a convulsive motion, and the limbs contracted. With a jerk the white body rolled over so that its face was turned into our direction. For a moment I was so struck with horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black, those eyes, deep, jetty black, in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like those of other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken into their orbits, and were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less prognathous than that of the average ape, and infinitely less hairy. The nose was quite distinct. As we gazed upon the uncanny sight presented to our vision, the thick lips opened, and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my coat sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird moving shadows on the walls. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified eyes fixed upon the floor ahead. The fear left, and wonder, awe, compassion, and reverence succeeded in its place, for the sounds uttered by the stricken figure that lay stretched out on the limestone had told us of the awesome truth. The creature I had killed The strange beast of the unfathomed cave was, or had at one time been, a man.
There is nothing more delightful to the thoroughly unscientific mind than to control some scientific machine which yields entertaining results, and which one does not in the least understand. That, so I concluded, was, at any rate, one of the reasons why I neglected all other duties, and most other pleasures, in order to enjoy my new wireless. Ad Astra was the name of it, and a very suitable one, for it put me into communication with places that seemed as remote as the planets, and evoked from them the very music of the spheres. It had 8 valves, whatever valves might be, and 2 switches, and 2 dials, and an index which made it perfectly easy to choose, as in a dinner at a restaurant, whatever one liked. Daventry and London, and Hiversham and Paris, and Berlin and Vienna were waiting with their dishes. A little adjustment of the switches and manipulation of the dials was all that was necessary. And then, after a few loud howls and whistlings, I could get into touch with singers and pianists halfway across Europe. This was all romantic enough for a prosaic age, but secretly I cherished even wilder romances in connection with my Ad Astra. It was, I am proud to say, the very last word in wireless, and every now and then it seemed, to my ignorant view, to emit noises that came from none of the localities of its sumptuous index. Below the blare of an orchestra from Berlin, I sometimes caught the sound of a human voice. Below a lecture, delivered in the studio in London, I caught the sound of singing. Scientific friends, who also heard these mutterings, appeared to me to be a little puzzled about them, but they bravely asserted that they were atmospherics. Yet they did not seem quite casual enough for mere accidents of the ether. Voices certainly made coherent remarks, unexplained instruments of music played arrangements of tunes, and somehow I'd got into my head that this wonderful Ad Astra could, intermittently and fortuitously, catch sounds that were outside the range of its professed radius. After all, as Mr. Einstein has proved to those who are able to understand what he says, time and space are both dimensions of the same huge whole, and I wondered whether it was not possible that Ad Astra was reproducing sounds not only distant in space, but distant in time. But I have no scientific attainments, and the professors, though sometimes a puzzled look furrowed their serene brows when they heard these extraneous noises, continued to say atmospherics. Just now, Ad Astra was clad in its neat serge travelling suit, and placed on the seat next to me in the train that was taking me to the old Cinque-Port town of Tillingham, where I was to spend a weekend with my friend Harry Armitage, in his house called Mayor's Orchard. He had just bought this house. I had never been there before, and knew nothing whatever of it and its surroundings, except that I was aware that the sea had retreated, and that Tillingham, which was once a port, was now a couple of miles inland. As I approached my destination, it looked as if I should not, for the present, get any clearer idea of it, for we slid into a thick sea fog. And, after innumerable hootings and stoppages, I stepped out into the most impenetrable mist I have ever encountered. Harry had sent down a servant to meet and conduct me, who told me that Mayor's Orchard was but 5 minutes' walk from the station, and I followed him through the dense white dusk up the hill. I carried Ad Astra myself, and presently he threw open a door, and I found myself in a delicious Queen Anne interior. In a little parlour off the hall, I found them at tea, Harry and his wife Evie, and her sister and brother-in-law, all old friends. I consented, of course, without any pressing at all, to demonstrate the marvels of my new toy, but never have I experienced a greater fall to my pride. We got a little scrannel jazz music from London, but no other station could come through at all. The fog, no doubt, was thick in the Channel, and the Channel was populous with fog-bound ships, and we could get nothing whatever except the insistent dot and dash of Morse code, ship calling to ship. Paris and Hiversham and Berlin and Vienna were all as mute as mackerel. There was nothing but this silly, unintelligible gabble. "Frightfully interesting," said Harry at length, "but a shade monotonous. How about bridge?" "I don't want to play," said Evie. "You four play." That was amiable, but false. Evie always wants to play bridge. Besides, every now and then, through this silly babble, I knew I had heard something, which was not Morse code, and I only wanted to be left with Ad Astra and find out what it was. So, after a few politenesses on the part of the others, I found myself alone with my machine. I could cut out these tiresome noises altogether, but I found that when I did that, I also cut out the intervening something, which I so much wanted to catch, and that when the dot and dash of this intership signalling was most audible, so also was this unexplained impression of what sounded sometimes like a voice, and sometimes like faint musical notes. Wholly unscientific as I am, I realised that it was not far distant in space, at any rate, from these stupid cacklings. It had something to do, in space if not time, with them. And then, as hairbreadth by hairbreadth, I shifted the dials, I heard, not from the machine at all, but from close outside, the sound of wind. A strong breeze was rising, and the fog, no doubt, dispersing, for almost immediately these dot and dash noises completely ceased. And, now that they were silent, I knew that I was right in thinking that there was something going on below them. It emerged, growing gradually louder. There was the noise of a drum, and of a fife, and of a cornet, and they were playing God Save the King, in a windy and elementary manner, but surely with enthusiasm. Then there was the sound of a door opening, and the tune swelled out suddenly, as if the door of the house where I sat had been opened and the players were just outside. The door shut again, the tune ceased altogether, and I heard a man's voice speaking in English but with a strong, guttural German accent. "Also, it is most kind of you, Mr. Mayor," he said. "To be sure, I shall be very comfortable. That goddamn fog, terrible, and a fool of a captain. Yes, a little supper, very pleasant. I will first to my room go." The voice ceased, but surely there were steps in the hall just outside and on the stairs. I looked out, but there was no one there, and now not a whisper came from my apparatus. This way and that, hairbreadth by hairbreadth, I moved the dials, but there was nothing of any sort audible. Presently Harry came in from the room where they were playing bridge, and found me still endeavouring to recapture that strange intrusion. Where had it come from? And when, so I could not help asking myself, had it come from? "Still tinkering," he said. "The stars seem to be a bit in eclipse tonight. A rocket went up just now from the sea. There must be some ship run aground in the fog. I'm dummy at the moment, so I came to see if you would like to be shown your room." "You're in the King's room," Evie said. I made a final attempt and got up. "Yes, do show it to me," I said. "But why the King's room?" He led the way upstairs. "Oh, an old story," he said, "but I believe quite authentic. George II was once visiting the Cinque Ports in his yacht, and there came on a thick fog, just like there was tonight, and he ran aground in shallow water opposite Tillingham. He was brought to land in a small boat and came up to the town. The mayor met him with all the pomp that could be arranged at a moment's notice, and they brought him along here, with a fife and a drum playing God Save the King." "And then?" I asked. "He slept here. The house belonged to the mayor's orchard, you know. There are some extremely old apple trees in the garden." "Interesting," said I. "And I'm going to sleep in the room he had. Yes, here it is. Jolly panelling, isn't it? There's a picture of the king. Thoroughly German. But, after all, he was German. He spoke English, though, which his father couldn't do, but with a strong German accent." Harry went back to his game. and it is hardly necessary to state, I instantly fetched Ad Astra up to my room. Berlin was ready to my summons now, and Vienna and Paris had never been so splendidly audible. But not a whisper more could I catch, coming across the years, from the night when the king slept at Mayor's Orchard. Ad Astra nobly vindicated its ability to give me all that it professed to give. But gladly would I have sacrificed all that for a few whispers more in that guttural voice, or a few more bars of that very imperfectly rendered national anthem. Atmospherics, indeed.
Divorced by Jean Raybrock. Amid the dust of the road still glittering in the rays of the setting sun, the evening mail coach passed, the old vehicle jolting about and the bells jingling on the little thin horses. Then Claudine appeared at the door of the little white house. With her hand over her eyes and her elbow high in the air, she stood motionless in sharp relief against the dark background of the interior. The young woman's robust chest was inflated with impatient, joyous expectation, and the blood rising under her brown skin brightened her black eyes and imparted a still deeper redness to her laughing lips that contrasted with the shining whiteness of her teeth. In the distance the sun, sinking ever lower, fastened its dying rays upon the fleecy tops of the wooded hillsides, imprinting upon the dark green of the old oaks points of light that quivered against the blue horizon, but nearer a large ray, piercing the verdure, enveloped, as with a last and tardy caress, the rounded summit of a naked hillock, whose slopes, dying at the turn in the road, presented in the shadow a long, dull, grey stretch of ploughed land. Claudine knew that beneath these slopes, over which resounded in the stillness of the evening the sonorous voices of the labourers urging on their oxen, lay immense quarries corroding the earth and extending on and on infinitely, seeming, with their buttressed galleries, like the suddenly cleared-up ruins of some buried city, and thither her thoughts went, in search of her husband. She saw him, young like herself and very handsome, perched on some high scaffolding, toiling at the top of the quarry in the trembling light of lamps that looked like stars amid the continual and monotonous dripping of the waters. But now his labor ended. He descended and arranged his tools. Then very quickly, thinking of her and impatient for her kisses, he came through the dark passages where the trucks had dug ruts in the mud. Quarrymen, wearing gaudy sashes, with jackets thrown over their shoulders, were beginning to appear in a series of groups along the white road. Their voices rose, sometimes in song, voices vibrating like waves of sunlight and as rough as the surrounding country. Incessantly the procession lengthened. One by one Claudine recognized these sunburnt faces as they grew more and more distinct. But her man did not yet appear, and suddenly, as she was examining with her sharpest look the farthest groups on the hillside, whose contours seemed to sink, a cloud of dust shot up, high and enormous, casting a vast shadow. The quarrymen stopped short in the road, then they ran back, and at the same time, with a settling of all the neighboring territory, a tremendous explosion burst out like a peal of thunder and roiled through the valley. The quarry had fallen in. Claudine uttered a cry and fell upon the road with arms outstretched. Under the ground, full of crevices and covered with fallen houses that spread their broken red-tiled roofs over the ruins like a mantle. Quarrymen were buried at inaccessible and hopeless depths, and near the foot of the hill, at a point where the engineers were trying to pierce a gallery, Claudine, in a crouching posture, with a wild look on her face and refusing to budge, awaited her man. For days she remained there, unable to believe in the disaster and unwilling to be consoled, her eyes fixed obstinately upon the gallery which they were opening. But the work caused fresh settlings of the soil, and then water flowed into the gallery, and they were obliged to stop their labors. Then gloomily she climbed the hill. At the top the workmen were now boring a shaft. She crouched down near them, watching the piston go up and down with a continuous mechanical movement, the dull shocks of which, occurring at regular intervals, quieted her and filled her with soothing hopes. But the steel screws began to break off in the flinty strata, and then they penetrated into the sands, which began to roll down continually, filling up the shaft. Haggard and grim, the workmen persisted for a time, but soon they threw down their tools in despair, and the band dispersed. Claudine was left alone upon the ravaged ground, amid the results of abortive labors, broken, inert, feeling only one desire within her, the wish that she were dead. "Claudine," whispered a voice near her. She recognized one of the quarrymen. She knew that his name was Pierre, and remembered having seen him at work with the others. He showed his callous hands, his soiled clothing, and suddenly, before he had spoken, as she saw the look of gentle sadness which he gave her, she burst into a fit of tears. He, finding nothing to say, knelt beside her, allowing her to weep, only pressing the young woman's hand the tighter at each sob, with an expression of anguish on his face. Gradually she became calm. She heard him saying things the meaning of which escaped her, leaving her only this sensation of a vague and very gentle murmur that lulled her into childlike docility, and she suffered herself to be led away, almost unconscious. He, full of precautions and attentions, addressing her in caressing tones, as though she were an invalid, while, from time to time also, she stopped to heave long sighs that suddenly broke into tears, after which her head would drop upon the man's shoulder. Days passed. The quarrymen were lost, undiscoverable, dead, it was declared, crushed by the rocks. This thought was a satisfaction to Claudine. In the long, idle hours in which these things were talked over, she listened silently, in mournful attitudes, finding gradually a soothing charm in being pitied. Little by little she seemed to awake as from a long sleep, and to return from a great distance, and at the same time, insensibly, the exigencies of life presented themselves to her mind. She began to live again, with the progressive growth of a slow fear, that of poverty and solitude. Then she became interested in the news, in the subscriptions opened for the relief of the victims, and suddenly she had a feeling of rest, almost of joy, when Pierre, returning from the city, told her that the sums subscribed were sufficient to warrant an annuity for the widows, and that she had been allowed one of 600 francs. Then, idle and patiently awaiting events, she daily returned to the quarries. Often Pierre accompanied her with his accustomed gentleness. There they spoke in low voices and walked with muffled tread, respectful of the grave. In these habitual visits as to a cemetery, where both went, over the hillside, Through the melancholy of the thick woods, under the perpetual influence of these same thoughts, Claudine's tears gradually ceased to flow. Insensibly they arrived at conversations and slow and gentle reveries in which new possibilities began to shape themselves. Gradually a weight was lifted from the young woman's breast. The horizon, long confined, enlarged about her, and in the trembling dawn of a new future there was a new and indefinable impression that grew rapidly in the penetrating charm of silence. Little by little, in the heat of summer, under the breath of the trees, her sorrow wore away, and lamentable death vanished in the distance, while slowly, like sap, a new love grew up that irradiated and enveloped them, but of which they dared not speak, out of respect for the grave which enabled them to meditate. "Claudine," said the man at last, "Pierre, suppose we marry?" "It has been only 2 months," said she, suddenly becoming sad. "Oh, I do not hurry you. I meant later. Would you?" "Yes." She sighed. "Later." Thenceforth it was an understood thing between them, upon which their thought centered more and more, according the dead only a friendly memory, a feeling of tender gratitude. They began to make plans. They wandered about in their accustomed walks with the manners of open lovers, and soon, upon the hillside tomb, amid the entwinings of the flowers, laughter was heard, and then kisses. One evening they went among the rocks loosened by the disaster. There, in the gentle warmth of the twilight, in their slow reverie of peasants, they looked through the trees below at the glittering of a stream, and, farther on, at the windings of the white road and the surrounding hills that enclosed them in a vast amphitheatre. Suddenly a strange noise startled them. It was in the ground beneath them, like the stirring of a beast at the bottom of a hole. They bent over the edge of a crevice, and there the noise, more distinct, seemed to them like the desperate clambering of a man in a narrow ditch. At first they were transfixed by fear of the unknown, then at the same time these same thoughts struck them, the thought of the quarrymen buried alive. From the bottom an appeal rose, far away, veiled, almost a breath. "It is he!" hissed Claudine, her knees trembling. Pierre was fairly livid as he straightened up. He, the dead already so far away, already disappeared in the abyss of irremediable things, and thus was their love to be broken, the future ruined, the beautiful future over which Claudine's 600 francs threw the glitter of fortune. By what right did he come back? His image now appeared, not in friendly perspective, surrounded with grateful memories, but as a menacing spectre suddenly arisen on the ruins of a shattered dream. Meanwhile the appeal rose again. They could imagine the exhaustion of the wretched man after crawling underground for nearly 3 months, living on roots and water, in the darkness, and doubtless aroused to a last effort by the perfume of the sun-bathed woods entering through the crevices in the ground. Pierre uttered a cry and threw himself violently backward, the victim of a bitter struggle. But again the appeal rose, sinister, lamentable, and pity gained the victory. Then he shouted feverishly and suddenly, "Wait for me! I run! I will come back with a rope! The hole is just big enough!" And he ran madly down the hillside. Left alone, Claudine looked fixedly at a rock overhanging the crevice. She shuddered. A breath would loosen it, and it would crush the man below. Suddenly she rose, staggering as if drunk, and bent over toward the rock. It loosened and rolled into the gulf. There was a dull shock, a cry, then all was still. Livid and leaning over the abyss, Claudine listened in the silence.